Okay. So today's seminar is the Organization of Nature, Trends in Theoretical Biology and Cognitive Science. Evolutionary biography is undergoing a profound theoretical shift, one in which dialectical principles closely tied to organism are gaining centrality. These ideas are being reintegrated into transformed scientific landscape, where new methodological tools make their study more viable than before. This move away from genocentric biology coincides with that is informed by parallel developments in cognitive science, particularly in the enactive approach to mind and cognition. Moreover, it carries significant implications for the philosophy of science, enabling a more reflexive, systemic, and critical framework, one in which the principles derived from scientific content can be applied to the study of scientific practice itself. This seminar seeks to reconstruct these emerging trends and explicitly link them to
Not
dialectics.
disturb.
Yeah.
Sorry. Say,
Did you have a question, Peggy? Okay, I will go back. So it carries significant implications for philosophy of science, enabling a more reflexive, systematic, and critical framework in which the principles derived from scientific content can be applied to the study of scientific practice itself. This seminar seeks to reconstruct these emerging trends and explicitly link them to dialectics, informal content, which is being taken up implicitly or explicitly by key researchers across the field. To accomplish this, we'll proceed in a circular fashion, from the history and theory of biology to questions in systems theory and philosophy of mind, and back again. In doing so, we'll articulate a renewed naturalism in philosophy for nature capable of bridging philosophy and science, ultimately confronting what Frank Thompson and Glessner 2024 term the scientific blind spot. There are 4 sessions, session 1, session 2, and session 3 and 4. And we'll be basically unpacking the various themes of that. I hand it back to you, Rasmus.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm Rasmus. I'm the one who's going to host this seminar series. I do currently doing a postdoc research project at the University of East China Normal University in Shanghai. And a lot of the work I will present in this series is either based on my PhD, which was recently published as a book that I made available for all of you. And then it's some new stuff that I'm trying to, that's part of my postdoctoral project. And but I also want to emphasize that I'm very open to suggestions, and I would very much like to hear your interests and then try to tailor the seminar to that. So I don't have a clear, like, I have some things, of course, I want to go through, but I'm very happy to hear from you and what your interests are and try to accommodate you in the best way possible and to make this more of a dialogue, so not just me lecturing. But today, since it's the first time, I have prepared a quite extensive lecture, and I will now try to share my screen, if it's possible. Wait, maybe I need to be admin then. I'm not sure. If I could have some help from the moderator to share the screen so I could begin. Let's see. Okay, wait, here we go. Okay, good. So, oh, Lund, can you help me? Okay, here we go. Okay. You have to, Lund, wait a second. I need, since I'm not on my own computer, you need to give me the print to do that because I have a. Now I should be allowed to share. Okay. So can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. That's bad. Let's see if we can do it. Let's try again. See. Okay, let's try share. Okay, now I think it should work. Now you
Yes.
can see it, right? Okay,
Yes, we
good.
can.
Okay, very well. So here you see the first the first slide, and this is you can see the whole the name of the seminar series. And today I've chosen to call this seminar "Which Synthesis?" because this is a question, a big question actually, surprisingly big question, and I will try to offer some clues and give a specific interpretation, but I will not be able to provide the full truth, put it like that. So let's see. This is the outline you can see. So this is how I will start. Start with the formation of this synthesis, then how it was kind of unraveled, and the proposed resolution, which is now an ongoing thing. And then finally, I will move to propose maybe that this is kind of a new philosophy of nature. We'll see. Anyway, so this is now a preliminary warning. I could say that I did this, spent probably 2 years trying to understand, well, at least 2 years of my PhD I spent on trying to understand the modern synthesis. And of course, I kept on trying to understand it now, and I've gone back now, and I'm still learning and still finding out what it is. It can be kind of frustrating because basically, the more you try to understand what it is, the more you understand that it's quite elusive, a quite elusive thing. It's difficult to understand it in terms of the normal, like the kind of concepts that you often use in philosophy of science, like paradigm or research tradition or these kind of things. It doesn't quite fit those, which is also part of the argument I'm going to make today. But I'm just saying this to kind of prepare you a little bit, and just to tell you that if you feel it's complex, that is just because, yeah, it's a reflection of the subject matter. It's not your problem. It's just how it is, unfortunately. But I think that the main thing I want you to take away from this seminar and the seminar series as a whole is kind of to show that philosophy is a profoundly historical and philosophical discipline. And we will see that at several junctures today. Besides that, I want to show in general just how important it is to have a historical approach to science and to be aware of the metaphors that they contain and the metaphors that we often confuse for theories and apply uncritically. So I think this kind of historical awareness is something I want to instill in you if possible. So let's see the aims of today's lecture. So you see, it's more or less the outline, but I'm mentioning some of the key reference points, and I'm not sure whether you had time to read the Smokovitis article. It's a very long article. It's an article that was published a year or two before the book that she published by the same name, and it is still kind of considered the most conclusive rendering of the history of the modern synthesis, or as she calls it, just the evolutionary synthesis. She doesn't like this term, the modern synthesis. So it's a very useful book in those terms. And it's a very complex book, and it's a book with a lot of like historiographical awareness. So I begin with a quick glossary. You can have a look at this or just memorize it, I guess, if you want. Take a screenshot. These are just some of the words that I will apply, that I will use in this lecture and will also be relevant later. So I won't read all of them, but I think the most important for our lecture today might be mechanism, teleology, vitalism, and organicism. But organicism is something I will spend more time in the next seminar. That's the plan because I will trace its history and also its kind of modern iteration, which I think is one of the most useful perspectives in biology right now. So then we have the very simple minimal requirements kind of for evolution. And you have variation, which is the fuel that you require, like it's required for natural selection to have something to select. And without any variation, there will be no change. So there will be no evolution without change, without variation. Inheritance, of course, is important because it's the retention of the traits of the variation across generations. And then you have, of course, selection. And I
Sorry,
see
Rasmus.
here I
I
just
think
say,
I think the
hmm?
slide is not changing for me. I think it's still stuck on the title slide. I don't know if
That's
it's
very
kind of
strange.
moved ahead.
It's not moving.
It's moving now.
Oh, okay. I can just keep my screen like this. I don't have to have full screen. Might just be
Ye-
the rendering of the problem of the having full screen. So I can just keep it like this if that's okay.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So here's the glossary. You can have a look now. Apologies, I had this problem before with sharing the when it was full screen. So I didn't think about this. Anyway, you can see this now. And then I will move on. That's okay. So here's the requirements that you can see again. So I would say that, okay, these are the minimal requirements. You find different versions of this sometimes. I'm just using this for brevity. And I'm also adding that the environment is a requirement. Of course, we could also add here the organism, but the organism could also be like, could be part of all the other conditions in a way. That's what we will see later. But I'm just going to treat these, this is just for brevity, just to like have some signposts to begin with, and then we will see it becomes increasingly complex. So the formation of the modern synthesis was between the 1930s and 50s. What is quite like it's even a little bit difficult to say exactly when it started, but it doesn't matter too much. And it's increasingly complex because a lot of the people that promoted the modern synthesis were also the people that wrote the history of the modern synthesis. And they would sometimes then emphasize their role to a larger degree than it might be actually like it might be overstated somewhat. And also they would like maybe to overstate the role of the specific discipline. But it's common to start around the 1930s and say that it was kind of established by the 1950s, but it was an ongoing struggle throughout, and it's more of a process than a finished product, to put it like that. And the pivot offense, which was very popular at that point, and the availability of specific scientific resources and techniques played an important role. And this is why certain views won out instead of others. And another point was that they had some important popularizers like Julian Huxley. And he was the one who actually coined the term modern synthesis in his book in 1942. And he promoted this understanding, this grand narrative, which also was promoted by Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky, among others. And these are also the central characters in the narrative that Smokowitis is making. Um, but you can see here that before the modern synthesis, Darwinism was almost extinct, and this is quite like if we see now, of course we believe that evolution is so like Darwin is everywhere, right? But at that point, actually, Darwinism and the notion of natural selection was on the brink of extinction. And the reason was that it was considered a kind of speculative theory, natural history, you know. It was not truly like evolutionary theory. It was not considered scientific, you know. And what really saved Darwinism was the invention of populational genetics, because this was what made it possible to establish evolution as a quantitative science. And it became an experimental discipline. And in this way, the eclipse of Darwinism was overcome. And one of the main theoretical inventions of this is what Ernst Mayr called populational thinking. And it's easy to misunderstand populational thinking as being about taking the population as the unit of analysis, but actually instead it's about looking at the population and the variation that exists within it. So it's still focused on individuals, but individuals within populations. So here's worth quoting Ernst Mayr. Have a look at one of his quotation, how he defined it. So you see here that he then is opposed to the typologist, and is also opposed to like essentialism within biology, and want to see everything as composed of unique features, and also describable only in statistical terms. And this is important because statistical terms means that it can't be reduced to more like deterministic sciences, basically. So this is establishing biology as a quantitative statistical science. This was very fundamental to Mayer's view. So now we get to like an important part of this again. It's like if we now we get to kind of textbook description, which is useful to just go through this, although it's a simplification, and that is the notion that the modern synthesis was a marriage between Darwin and Mendel. And it took from Darwin the theory of natural selection, and from Mendel it took his theory of genetics, basically, that, you know, he studied beans and he could see from one generation, there's a change of one trait, and if it's inherited by if both parents have this trait, then could be recessive, or if it's dominant. You know, this is kind of textbook thing everybody learned in high school. It's not the full story of genetics, of course, but it's a kind of the important part of this is that it's a discrete kind of inheritance. But anyway, I will get back to this in 2 seconds. Just the simplification involved here, just worth mentioning, is that it doesn't really say anything about the relative contribution of Darwin and Mendel. And it doesn't say anything about the compromises that were actually made. So it gives the impression that, and this is something I will emphasize later, that it was simply like a missing piece in the puzzle. Anyway, we can see Smokovitis, the way she describes the modern synthesis, I think, is more precise. And this is to bring together the material basis of evolution with the mechanical cause of evolutionary change, which is selection. Then you have the different protagonists. And in the story told by Smokovitis, it's focused mostly on Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky. And I would just like to say, just to be clear, I know that all of these are men, and I mean that reflects, of course, the status of science at that point. This is not to say that there were not important women involved. And I could only mention Barbara McClintock and Lynn Margulis at this point, but tellingly, their perspectives were often marginalized and only more recently actually have come to fruition and gained more prominence, especially the theory of endosymbiosis by Lynn Margulis. And I will emphasize her and put more focus on her in the next lecture. In any case, the contribution of Mendel was the independent inheritance of variation, the notion that variation is always abundant in population, so it's copious. And then you have some tension, of course, which I mentioned. Like Mendel believed that there could be very discontinuous change based on mutations. And this went against Darwin's notion of gradualism, as we will see. But the discrete inheritance is the main thing here. So anyway, here you can see some of the tensions that I mentioned. So Mendel's notion of inheritance offered the explanation of inheritance that Darwin had lacked. And it allowed the notion of abundance of variation so that natural selection doesn't have to wait. This is a very important point. I think that like I said, the details are not too important here, but you have dominant and recessive traits, and everybody knows about eye color, these kind of things, where both parents need to have the gene for the recessive traits. Otherwise, the child would not get this trait. Darwin, on the other hand, he held that there were gemmules that were inherited. He also believed in blending inheritance, which basically mean that the offspring would have an intermediate of the parents, of the traits of the parents. But this led to a problem because it basically meant that over time, natural selection would actually undermine the variation it relied on because it would average out. So this is why Mendel is so important actually to the modern synthesis, because it offers a different way of explaining variation and how variation is maintained within populations. So they took from Mendel the notion that different traits were inherently independently inherited, but that they together would contribute to the establishment of a specific trait. So this was the way that they could overcome the kind of the problem of saltationism that you find in Mendel, because they would say that within populations, changes will be gradual. They will be more like, because they depend on the spread within populations. So you will not, and they will be like the traits would have to be combined. So we should not expect a lot of like rapid change, So let's see. Another point here, before I move on, another point here is that Mendel also thought that genes were not affected by the activities of the parents. So they would be subject to natural selection, of course, and then they would be picked out within a population, and then based on whether they would succeed or not, create the phenotype that survived or not, they could go to the next generation, but they will not be affected. So you overcome the kind of Lamarckian heritage that you still find in Darwin, where there is room for kind of inheritance of acquired traits. Against this, genetic factors were completely unaffected by the life activities of the organism, and therefore they were pristine. They would be inherited in a pristine status, and they would not be any effect by what the organism did. And this is also a fundamental thing in the modern synthesis. So this points to the difference between soft and hard inheritance that you find in the modern synthesis, and only hard inheritance is included in the synthesis. Anyway, let's move on. So Smokovitis calls this a delicate balance, and I think that's a very good way of phrasing it. The delicate balance she is talking about is between the unity and the autonomy of biology. So the main task here was to maintain the autonomy of biology as a separate discipline, which could not be reduced to physics or chemistry, but at the same time, it had to be scientific. So it needed to be a kind of mechanistic theory, because the mechanistic idea was what you find in physics and chemistry. And it had to be aligned with this scientific ideal of unification. So, but to establish the modern synthesis was the great project was to make autonomous science of life. So the autonomy had to be maintained. And to do this, they needed to reject vitalism, as you see. And you had to have a kind of restricted mechanism with emergent properties. So here comes the notion of emergence, which is about the irreducibility to levels beneath it. But this is also kind of unstable, as we will see. But they had to get rid of the kind of mystical heritage that came from vitalism, the notion of a life force. And they had to strike a balance with mechanism. So this is a delicate balance for sure. And we will see that it will be threatened at several junctures. And there's also a remnant here of teleological thinking in the way that natural selection is described. So this is another point here that we will see. And there were some within the synthesis, actually, like Haldane, who denied the ability of mechanistic principles to explain life exclusively. So there were like people actually like already at that point being a bit like we feeling that they maybe gone too far in a mechanistic direction. And they had to opt for a very restricted kind of mechanism then, and strike the right balance. So walking this fine line and providing biology with scientific legitimacy would prove the central problem of the 20th century biological science, according to Smokovitis. And significantly, it had to black box parts of biology, parts of like life processes that were evidently present, but could not really be part of the theory, because it introduced notions that were apparently non-scientific. So Smokovitis shows how biology overcame its internal fragmentation by suppressing some of the views that did not fit the neat model. And there was another tendency here, of course, which was the organistic view, which placed the organism at the center. And this again, Haldane was one of the proponents of this view, and he was in favor of a more holistic notion. And we will see in the next lecture, when I discuss what's called the Theoretical Biology Club, that this was also part of his turn to more like dialectical thinking. And this is, the dialectical view is kind of lurking in the background here. And it forms a kind of undercurrent in this whole history. But developmental processes, so everything the organism does in its lifetime, had to be black boxed, had to be suppressed. It had to be a result of something else, not a force of evolutionary force in its own right. The environment, on the other hand, was, of course, like you couldn't explain natural selection without the environment, right? But at the same time, it was considered something like it was still just there in the results. It was not really studied too much, like as something that was dynamic, changing, interacting with the organism, these kind of things. So it was a kind of static background for the whole way, because they focused on populations, right? And the individuals in populations, they didn't need to care too much about the different things that were also there, because they could just look at the results and then they can, do their kind of experimental science, and then the things that they black boxed, it didn't matter that much, it would be marginalized. It would be like, yeah, it's there, but it doesn't do that much. So that was kind of their strategy. And this was justified through the metaphor of the genetic program, where they thought that all the information that you needed to build the adult organism was stored in the kind of like in the DNA, and was read out just like unrolling of a potential. So there was no like reciprocity, or it was just a linear kind of account of how organisms were formed. And so it was also then development was considered something conservative, and it was considered a matter of fine-tuning. It was not something that contributed any variation on its own. So it was not a source of novelty in evolution. So these two things are connected, of course, because the main point here is that neither the organisms or the environment, like the interaction between them, disappear, right? That's what happens. And organisms are deprived of agency. So this made the evolution into like one mode, which they said that is smooth adaptive shifts via shifting gene frequencies. So any change in the phenotype had to be explained by a change in the genotype. So I know this is a lot, but I'm trying to just go through the basics here now, and then I can try to elaborate a little bit more later. But these are just some basic kind of premises of the whole modern synthesis as a program for unification of biology. So I think at this point, the notion of ultimate and proximate causes is useful to highlight. And this is something that Ernst Mayr highlighted. And you see, this was in 1961, which is actually like then after the point when I said, okay, it ended in 1950. Well, Meyer formulated these two principles at a later stage, but he had thought in these terms all the way through. Basically, but this is something he formulated as a reply, as a response to some of the challenges that the modern synthesis were met with. So I think it's useful to put it here, because it makes a lot of sense of the things that is being said, the choices that are being made at an earlier point. And this is, as we can see, like you have a how something works, just like the kind of releasing cause, these kind of things, proximate, that's development, physiology, environment. And then you have the ultimate causes, that is evolution and natural selection. So then the organism is an internal proximate cause, the environment is external proximate cause. And I would like to emphasize here, I'm not going to go through all the things he said. Like you have the notion of teleonomy. We could talk about that later. It's almost the same as teleology, but it's not quite because he says it's kind of apparent. Is teleonomy is the kind of purposiveness of natural selection. So it's only after the fact, actually. So yeah, it's not it's not teleology in the way maybe we normally understand it, more like Aristotelian goal directedness, these kind of things. It's apparent goal directedness, basically. But I think that it's important here to emphasize that when Ernst Mayr is making this distinction, he is not really acting as a biologist. He is acting as a philosopher. And I think this is crucial to see that not only did Ernst Mayr act as a biologist, he also acted as a historian and then also as a philosopher. And I think that's why I'm focusing quite a lot on Ernst Mayr here, even if he's just one actor, because he was very significant throughout the history of the modern synthesis. Anyway, now I get to just try to summarize some of the core tenets, and then I will home in on some more specific details. Let's see. I'm just going to see if anybody wrote. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Core tenets.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I just raised my hand there, but you probably can't see. I just wanted to. Hi. My name is Neve. I just wanted to ask you very quickly about Meyer and Kant. And you mentioned Haldane's rejection of mechanism. And are we understanding mechanism in that kind of Kantian sense of kind of functionalist in theology, and Kant's sort of fear about this sort of instrumentalization? Let's say he's talking more about the human, obviously, but I'm just trying to kind of, sort of, look at maybe that kind of philosophical trajectory here in the background, where Kant is also, then really talking about more the organicist, sort of autonomy of the organism and its agency, but then that's nested within an epistemology. So that's really my question here, I guess, actually, is it about biology as an independent sort of science, on its own ground, epistemologically speaking, because in a way Kant's system is also about that. It's not just about rationalizing the autonomy of the human. It's about how philosophy can actually rationalize that, so yeah, I'm just thinking about how those moves in there about sort of, functionalism versus organicism are also nested within an epistemological sort of question, and that's really kind of, that seems to be the kind of thrust, one of the things you're emphasizing here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I might just answer briefly, and then I think maybe I will be able to answer your questions through the lecture. Otherwise, I will try to elaborate more in the end. But I think you could say that it's a principle of intelligibility, right? And that will be, in a Kantian sense, something about I don't know how much people know about Kant, but it will be about it's a kind of transcendental principle, right? So it is kind of a way to say, look, we're establishing biology. Now we can understand what biology is, and we can understand biological processes in this way. So these moves that are being made are trying to, like, they are Kantian in that sense. I don't quite know the full, like, whether Meyer had read Kant and whether that was an inspiration to him, but it is interesting that you're asking this question because, of course, Kant, in modern times, Kant was one of the people that actually tried to theorize teleology. But then Kant basically ended up in what you say, you call it like functionalism, I would say maybe instrumentalism, where Kant didn't actually say, okay, look, we have to understand organisms in this way, but it doesn't. But ultimately, we can't know whether or not they are actually teleological. So mechanism wins out because that was kind of the science of the day, and Newtonian principles were transcendental principles, like they were objective in the sense that teleological principles were not. But this is a very I think Kant actually fails on that point, but that's another big question. So I don't know if I answered you. That was okay.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to discuss it more, but I have a lot of slides, so I think I need to move on if we're gonna get if we're not gonna spend all, well, for me it's night to spend all morning for you. So okay, but thank you for that question. It's interesting. I would think more about it. It would be interesting to check this link between a possible link between Kant and Meyer. And of course, German idealism was important in general for biology, which is something I want to also go into more. But I'm not focusing really on the history of biology as such now. I'm focusing more on just the modern synthesis because it's a easier place to start. Because otherwise, it would be it would take too long. Okay, so just to summarize here, then go back to the core tenets, and you can see here that we have the pan-selectionism. And by this, I mean here at this point, it's just the primacy of natural selection. But as we shall see, it becomes more important as the modern synthesis develops. Then you have gradualism, and then you have extrapolationism, as they call it, that the notion that you can simply extrapolate from micro to macro evolution. And this is kind of the idea that you can study just the changes of individuals within populations, and then you can scale this up. So then you don't really have to study, development then, because development is what happens in between. Doesn't matter really. It's just like what happens to the genes, and that's the genes are at the micro level, natural selection at the macro level, and then everything in between is just products of those things, basically, in very simple terms. So that's why Dobzhansky then formulated his notion, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And this is also the part of, you see the architects trying to, solidify their views and say, evolution is the kind of central science, central discipline of biology, basically. So like I said, macroevolution is just microevolution over longer time scales. But I think it's very important to say that these core tenets is, as Mokosvitis says in a more recent text, is like a loose consensus rather than a strict framework. And it masks tensions between the different disciplines that people came from and they favored. And there were, it was clearly not seamless unification. That's why it also lasted for over 20 years, right? But Smokovitz nonetheless says that this sense that they had of having a common project created this kind of spirit of unity among these biologists. And this was more important maybe than having an actual framework that was more rigid. And I think also one thing we could say that, as I said to begin with, to treat these different dimensions of evolution as quasi-autonomous was also pragmatically a very brilliant way of dealing with these inner tensions, because then people could just deal with, they could focus on specific parts, and then they didn't have to try to see how all of these things actually combine, right? So at the end, it accomplished its fundamental goal, and it managed to integrate biology, and it presented itself as a framework, although it was a much more unstable thing and much more elusive thing. And here comes to the point where I was alluding to earlier, is that it was a principle of intelligibility for evolution as a unifying principle for biology. So that might be something to do with the kind of Kantian background here. Not sure. But here comes a part now that I will have to go run through it a little bit quicker than I planned, but this is something that I feel is worth mentioning because it's something that is often left out in the histories of the modern synthesis, and that is the creativity of natural selection. So I think many people, when you think about evolution, you imagine that variation is something that emerges first. So that would be like mutations, right? And then you have selection coming in and deciding which one, like negating the bad options, you know. And then through negation, then you have some people survive, some variants survive, some do not survive, and then over time you will see differences, you know, in populations. But actually, the architects of the modern synthesis, they actually thought that that natural selection also created the variation that it selects from. And this means that natural selection has a very fundamental role. And this is, of course, the heritage of Darwin more than Mendel. And the point here is that mutation only was kind of like the raw material, as Gould says, that it was natural selection then that would combine this raw material and make it into actual like phenotypic variation, you see. So by itself, mutations did nothing, basically. That's the point. And this is a very important principle. And I think it's often forgotten, but it's crucial actually to understanding some of these debates. And of course, another thing we can mention here is, of course, that they like one of the core things they had to also then maintain was that variation or mutations were blind. Like, and when I say blind, it means that it didn't emerge because it had a specific selective value or because it was already like, it didn't have any adaptive value. It wasn't biased in any way. Because the only thing that could introduce bias into evolution was natural selection, basically. And this is why Stephen Jay Gould emphasizes this point. And Beatty even says it might have been the only core commitment, but I'm not so sure. So here you see the notion that it was blind and notion that it was an architect, you know, composer, sculptor. You know, there's very like beautiful metaphors to describe natural selection. And this might have been the essence of Darwinism. But the question is, was it the essence actually of the modern synthesis? Well, this is what is really like up for debate. But for the architects, this was the essence. And this shows their commitment to this like core Darwinist premise, basically. So this is also where you see, is there actually like a hidden kind of teleology in place here? And you see that this is the famous quotation that it's not really clear who said this. And some say it was Haldane. It might have been someone else. It's a little bit esoteric, but it makes a good point. And it basically says that teleology is like the mistress that the biologist cannot do without, but hides from the public. So some kind of hidden teleology is operative, but it cannot be really admitted by these biologists, basically. So many of them then would say, actually, some of them would actually call natural selection an agent, but most of the time they would call natural selection a mechanism because it sounded more scientific. So now we're almost at the end of this part, but I have to mention just some of the criticisms then that it was faced with. And this is, so you see then you have from, I said 1940s to 1950s is like the period where it was established kind of. But then you have also within that period, it became more restrictive. Basically, or it hardened. This is the criticism that Stephen Jay Gould made. And you see here that to begin with, you have different causes. So natural selection was the primary directing force for sure, but there were other processes involved. Like they could affect a little bit here and there. So you had migration, you had mutation, could do something, and then you had random drift. Um, so this is basically like migration would create some kind of gene flow within population, and then mutations would also some rare cases mutations could actually create some variation, and then there would be some randomness to how that things would not actually be survive simply because natural selection had worked on it from the outside. So this means that evolution did not necessarily have a progressive direction, and the organisms weren't necessarily better adapted over time. And this was again, Haldane thought that this was like you can find cases where there were no evident selective advantage for why things existed. And this is also what's called orthogenesis, where you have kind of specific canalizations that natural selection can't really counteract. And it's like the variation that already exists will decide what can exist in the future and these kind of things. But this is something that had to be discarded because it introduced again like another factor of direction in evolution. And this was at some point not acceptable, basically. So after a pluralistic phase, where the main thing was that you could have many different theories of change, but it had to be related to Mendelian genetics and population genetics and stuff like that. Natural selection became not only a necessary, but a sufficient explanation. And Smokovitis says that this has to do with political context. That might be true. I mean, it might be true in the case of Huxley for sure, because he felt that in that political context around, it's a world war, stuff like that, mechanism represented communism and vitalism represented fascism, and then biology had to be something in between, and the liberal ideal of progress had to be defended. So then you couldn't have this kind of random evolution where things happen due to chance, randomly. This had to be discarded. This is something, I mean, it would be interesting to look into more. Actually, I don't quite know whether this was the decisive reason, but for sure a hardening happened if we follow Gould. And but he doesn't really speculate much in the reason. He doesn't necessarily explain it that much, but people were falling in line for sure. And the primacy of natural selection was really insisted upon. So this was a shift in the modern synthesis, and I think it made it in one sense also more fragile to attacks. So this is the background for what's called Adaptationist program by Gould and Levontin that they later would criticize, and where anything that exists in a way, any trait, if it is able to survive in a population, has to be adaptive. There's no other way. Natural selection must have said, oh, there's some good reason for this thing to exist, And this is just so stories. So why does the giraffe has a long neck or something like that? And you can make up just a story like that, And this is completely unfalsifiable. That's what they would say. It's not really science anymore. It's just again, it's kind of philosophy, right? That's the point. And there's no role here for kind of ongoing adaptivity, as you might call it, which we will touch upon later. There is something very circular about this as well, but can't go too much into it. It should be noted, though, that although the role of the organism is kind of like it has a apparently rather insignificant role, at least in the actual process of evolution, but theoretically it's important because if organisms are not integrated wholes, then it appears that genes are picked out in isolation. So it becomes then you have another like tendency towards like it opens up a possibility of reducing evolution to genetic factors alone and then reducing it to chemistry. So this is why you have to insist on the organism, because the organism is the level at which selection works, a level at which it can perceive different phenotypic traits and select. So even if it's ultimately genes that are selected from the perspective of natural selection, it can't perceive the genetics directly. So only indirectly can they be selected. This is a very important principle for Meyer, for instance. But this was difficult to maintain because they had set it up in a way that made it somewhat fragile. So again, now we get to part two. So this is now the molecular revolution. And this is also part of the reason I think that the modern synthesis became hardened, because they basically had to stave off this challenge. So the molecular revolution was in 1953. That was the discovery of DNA, of course. And one of the discoverers, Crick, he actually said that he thought that life could be reduced to chemistry. And of course, this was preposterous for all of these biologists. And they were really, really, really opposed and really scared, because they saw that a lot of funding was going to molecular biology. And again, they felt that they were kind of like seen as unscientific and, really, really scared of the status of evolutionary biology within biology as such. And also seeing that many of these now people that did molecular biology didn't have any training even in biology, which was, to them really, really like a moment of crisis. That's basically what they perceived it as. So in this situation, they would deliver very passionate defenses of their views, criticize molecular biology very strongly, and Ernst Mayr would make use of his notion of ultimate and proximate causation to say that, okay, fine, the DNA is important, we can study chemistry and blah 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 of evolution, but it can only be a proximate cause, So they would just really say that, still natural selection reigns supreme, basically. And again, then we have the mutationist challenge, which is part of this stuff. And this is, they basically they said that they wanted to reduce natural selection to a purely like negative sieve and not responsible for variation, basically. And in this view of the mutationists or neutralists, they would say that most variations are either deleterious or neutral with regard to fitness. And then for this reason, they wouldn't be affected by natural selection, because natural selection will only select what's beneficial, right? So this reintroduced the notion that, maybe it's genetic drift that would explain a lot of this, So a lot of randomness was introduced again. And they would say that it's actually not enough variation in a population for selection. So selection might be constrained by other factors, So it can't be the sole factor, sole directing force in evolution. So this again, now we have another challenge to the adaptationist framework. But the architects did not change their view. They would still say that natural selection was creative, and they would say that, okay, they can explain the unity of life through these kind of generic physical principles and the basic like self-organizing principles that all things that live need, but they couldn't explain the diversity, how different species emerged, how different organisms would thrive in their environment, these kind of things. That had to be explained by natural selection, which was the only way of explaining evolution. So this is the point when they will say, oh, actually, we are doing organismal biology and they are doing molecular biology. So then you see, okay, so the organism is important at this like rhetorical level, right? Even if you don't really care about it that much in your studies, you need to maintain it, right? So it was crucial, the organism was crucial as a historical outcome of natural selection. And then you see, okay, so then it's also the reason why then Richard Dawkins was not part of this. Actually, like Richard Dawkins is one of the most famous biologists now, popularizers and stuff like that. But actually, Ernst Mayr really like criticized that way of doing biology because they took this gene's eye view to a logical extreme, and then the problem became that okay, but then you might as well just reduce everything to chemistry. That was the problem for them. So they had to say it's an emergent integrated whole, and this was something they insisted on the whole time. So now I will round up this part soon, but as I've said, there's clearly like a lot of philosophy going on here, actually, right? And they cast doubt about some of the core commitments, but these commitments are more like metaphors and analogies than really like empirically proved, right? So, but they would just some things were integrated, of course, and they did accommodate them on some points, and that was kind of the point of proximate ultimate. They say, okay, yeah, we take you in, but we marginalize the effects of the things you are studying, right? So this is what Dennis Walsh, who is a philosopher of biology, has called fractionation. And this is also what I spoke about earlier, like that the forces, the processes of evolution were treated as quasi-autonomous, right? So it enabled mathematically tractable models and a clear division of labor, but it lost actual understanding of the complexity of evolution and, for instance, the reciprocal causation between organism and environment. So it was a unification of biology, sure, like institutionally it happened, but conceptually it was more fragmented. And this is maybe the great irony, you could say, and also the great weakness. So to have a little pause now, we can have a look at this figure. This is just how, this is from Lin Xiu, I don't know how to pronounce it. The text that I shared with you, so you could see how she has illustrated this kind of fractionation of evolutionary theory. So I don't know if this makes, let's see how we can understand this. Yeah. She in the middle, I guess we find development phenotype. Yeah, we see how they all are treated as, you see, they only go one way out from here instead of moving in both directions as we should see in the more complex versions. So I think now at the end, I want to just raise a question before we move to the synthesis extended evolutionary synthesis. And this is the question, is natural selection even a cause? And I mean, you could say, okay, what do we mean by that? What do we mean if something is a cause or not? But I guess the point that at least this quotation from Depew says is like is natural selection actually explanatory? Can it explain the variation that we can perceive within uh, within populations, or is it something that actually comes afterwards to stabilize in a way the things that are already proposed by other processes? And of course, this is not to say that at that point it wouldn't be a cause, because if we think dialectically about it, a cause can then become like a consequence can then become a cause in the future, of course. So this is not to say that it's not a cause at all, but it might, like in many cases, what we see as evolutionary change is actually driven by other processes, and then natural selection is actually just a product of those processes. And this is what we will see as we move to a more complex reciprocal notion. But as Stephen Jay Gould has said, that natural selection is actually more about just bookkeeping. So it is useful then to ask. I mean, so basically, natural selection is kind of abstract. It doesn't really explain like the the things that Meyer described at Proximate. We could say might be much more important to evolution than we think. So the how can also explain the why. I suppose this is the what we might say as a simple way of phrasing it. So right now, where are we? This is difficult to say. I mean, I'm trained as a philosopher. I don't have the full like I don't do evolution as a biologist, but from what I've heard from my biology friends and from like if you look at textbooks, the modern synthesis is not really that much of a thing anymore. Like, of course, there are some aspects of the modern synthesis still operative, but the notion that natural selection is creative, I think, is not really something. I mean, it was always a metaphor anyway, right? So is it really like, does it do that much work for the biologist in their daily research? Probably not. Uh, And if we then like if mutations then have more of a role, then that would actually be more of a Mendelian than a Darwinian point. So this is where some people would say that actually like the current status, the current state is less Darwinian than and more Mendelian. It's not for me to decide at this point, but it does offer like there are something about it, because then you could say that, okay, so if this is the case, then the calls to go to extend the synthesis would then that be actually to go more back to the Darwinian view. And what does that mean then? So I think this is something we should keep in mind. In any case, this is the summary. This is also from the thing that I shared with you. It's very difficult to see all of it now since it's not full screen, but maybe I can do it just for this one. So this is the kind of, you can see this in the course material, but this is her attempt at summarizing. We should keep in mind that the one of the texts that I shared, this is written by one of the people that were part of the extended evolutionary synthesis project. So her rendering of the modern synthesis might be a little bit biased, and so we should keep that in mind. And then finally, I think this is a very interesting article that I think would be worth reading if you're curious about this. And this is Smokovitis then writing almost 30 years later and saying basically that there's a lack of historical awareness in the extended evolutionary synthesis, and so they overstate their target, like the integrity of the target they are trying to challenge basically. Yes, I will take a break within 2 minutes. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Just gonna complete this part. It's just that this is the final part, and then we go to the. I will go quickly through the last stuff, but still have quite a lot left. So the point is, she talks about like what's actually now the current state of biology. She calls it integrative biology, and a lot of biologists have already moved on, and they are trying actually to integrate different fields of biology, and don't really care too much about the modern synthesis. But I would say that regardless of this, even if biology has moved on in favor of integration, it doesn't mean that you don't have some of the same basic assumptions. So the moving targets status of the MS doesn't mean, and the notion that it's not a monolithic theory doesn't mean that some of the prevailing notions are now like completely lost in biology. So this is again like uh, just as the modern synthesis is not like a clear break with the previous way of thinking, then also what she's talking about, integrative biology, would also not be a clean break. So I would say that the extended evolutionary synthesis, irrespective of Smokovitis' criticism, although I think is relevant, especially the kind of historical awareness that she is emphasizing, is still relevant because I think institutional framework and theoretical assumptions they are not the same. So I think there are still like kind of genecentrism at play. There are still some kind of notion of primacy of selection. And this is based on basically what you see about like in terms of textbooks and priorities and funding. So now I will move on to the extended evolutionary synthesis, and this is the final part, but we can have a break now, I suppose. I'm going on for a very long time. Okay, so should we? I'm mindful of your time. But if we have a break until 1:30, and then I can go on a little bit more, like I try to wrap it up within 15, 20 minutes, and then we have time to talk, discuss a bit. Would that be okay? Or anybody have any misgivings about that? Okay, okay, okay. Okay, so let's regroup in at 1:30. And please, if you have any like questions in the meantime, that just write them in the chat, and I will try to like address them at the end or whatever. And yeah, and also please intervene later if there's anything. Okay. Mm. So I'm still sharing my screen, right? Just to
Yes,
confirm.
you are.
Okay.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, good, good, good. So I was just gonna reply to the chat here quickly. Um, I'm gonna share the slides. Yeah, I can share everything. I also have a manuscript. I can share the whole thing with you. Uh, I'm not following it too closely, but I'll share it with you. And it has also resources like the references and stuff. Otherwise, I see there's a question about abiogenesis, and I guess that refers to the Miller-Urey experiment into origins of life. Like and that they were chemical. I think the only remark I can make about that, I'm not an expert on this exact experiment. I was considering including it in the question about the molecular revolution because, of course, it's the same year as the discovery of DNA, and it really contributed to the molecular revolution. So it was part of something actually that the modern synthesis architects felt threatened by. So it was not itself part of the modern synthesis in the sense that I think it would be considered something outside its scope in the sense that it's more of a chemical theory. But it would be something we could discuss later because origin of life, of course, is something that is it's not my area of expertise, but it is, of course, something that is also relevant within, for instance, the works of Lynn Margulis and the question of Gaia and how these cyanobacteria actually changed the atmosphere of the planet and therefore made life more made the atmosphere more hospitable to life. And I guess that also is a kind of argument against this notion of abiogenesis. But I'm not really an expert on this in itself. But I do know that this Miller-Urey experiment was crucial to also the popularity of the molecular biology. So that's the short note I can make about that. Yeah, I don't think there were. Yes, if this is something you would be interested in discussing more, please let me know, and I can try to like look into it or like speak a little bit more about Lynn Margulis. I'd be happy to do that because she has a very fascinating theory and very relevant to a lot of this. Anyway, let's see. I'll go back now to where we were. And please intervene at any point if something is unclear. But if I mean, maybe it's better you try to wait until the end because it will probably take longer if because I will go on a tangent about something. But maybe I should just try to get through this because I still have a little bit of stuff. But if it's something really like pressing matter, please do it or write in the chat, and I will try to look later. Anyway. We now get to the proposed resolution, and I've already kind of criticized the extended evolutionary synthesis, or at least I've taken up the criticism that Smokovitis is giving. Now I will try maybe to give it a bit more fair, because I mean I can say for my own part I was also very like when I did my PhD, I was like, oh, extended evolutionary synthesis sounds really cool, you know, and I went to conferences and I read a lot of these papers. But it is true in hindsight when I read Smokovit, she is correct in the sense that there is a lack of historical awareness and historical like, but I think as with any kind of scientific attempt at creating a new perspective, there will be some people that are more diligent and do it in a more fruitful manner than others. And I think the ones I'm going to discuss are the kind of the most interesting and most useful ones. But there are a lot of also different conflicts going on within the extended evolutionary synthesis. And as happened also in previous times, there are some more traditional biologists that are really, really opposed to it. So that might also indicate that they are actually touching upon something. But the response by other biologists is a little bit, they feel a bit perplexed, like, okay, but we already know this. So you see, this is the kind of like, in some cases, they might be kicking in open doors, you know what I mean? But that also depends on the discipline we're talking about, right? So the complexity here is really, really vast. But yeah, anyway, I think the first thing we need to get out of the like get out of the way is the notion that it's about the complete refutation of Darwinism. Now, what is Darwinism? Well, at least it means that we have to have an emphasis on natural selection as a force in evolution, important force. But now the question then becomes, but how do we conceive natural selection? And this is gonna try to explain how we can try to understand natural selection. So question is, why now? I don't have a good answer. Smokovitis says that she feels it's a little bit like deja vu, because it's like the kind of things that Levantin and Gould and other outliers already emphasized a long time ago. And even like I think it's the 1930s, Haldane is kind of saying like, okay, but we will have a more like broader synthesis in the future. You know, he already could see some tendencies. That was in 1953, actually. So, but it seems now that we've kind of reached a point where there's piled up a lot of empirical findings that can't really be accommodated by the modern synthesis. At least this is what the extended evolutionary synthesis people would say. But I think an important point here is actually like just the fact that the architects are no longer here to defend their theories. So there's not this kind of like prestige that they have to maintain, you know? And then also you have the more advanced, more, sophisticated tools that were not at their disposal at that point. So that means that we know like multi-scale modeling and those kind of things that already made biology more complex, right? So it basically shows that biology has already started, even before this, they have started to move in a different direction. So it basically confirms what Smokovitis is saying. I guess what the extended evolutionary synthesis people is saying, sure, but we still lack this kind of framework, like more encompassing framework, you know? And okay, maybe they're right. Maybe this is needed. So, and also they were given some big grants, and you know, so it's shifting a little bit. And yeah. Anyway, this is Kevin Leyland. I should say Layla because he actually has recently changed his name because yeah, it's not a big deal right now, but it's important to say. But at that point, he was still calling himself Kevin Leyland, and this was, you see, it's already 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And they emphasize 4 points. You see, they emphasize the genocentric point, of course. And they speak about missing pieces. And let's see here. These are the missing pieces that they speak about. So it's developmental bias, which we already spoke about, how development might also be a cause. Then you have plasticity, which is the notion that organisms are not rigidly determined by their genetics, but have some leeway that they can exploit and then be able to actually respond, not simply like mechanically react, these kind of things. Then you have the notion of niche construction, of course, which is very important. And then you have extra genetic inheritance. So you have a notion that not only genes are transmitted, and I think the main thing here is that you reconceive these things that were considered proximate and considered results by the modern synthesis and say, actually, you know, they might be also causes. So then we get to back to this is Dennis Walsh and his notion of situated Darwinism, and he says we're moving now from object view to agent view. And here you have some other points that are useful to just have a look at. And we come back to the notion that natural selection is more of a higher order effect. Holism, adaptive plasticity. I mean, the notion that organisms are not machines, basically, you know? And also that organism and environment is one integrated system. And I think this is a very important way of thinking, that you move away from this kind of externalism. And this is also where you get, of course, the mechanical efficient causality, right? Where it's almost like there's like billiard balls like hitting each other. And this is, you know, not how it works, basically. And this is where you get to the dialectical view by Levontin and Levens, where organisms are subjects, not only objects. And here's a useful quotation where you see this notion of how there is reciprocity. And he speaks about the metaphor of adaptation. I think every time I hear metaphor of adaptation, I agree with him, but I would like to say it's not only a metaphor, because metaphors are not, you know, metaphors have effects, right? And I think like not only like scientifically, but also like I we have to like insist on the fact, I think, I mean, this is something I will argue later, that it's not only like how we see it. Oh, it seems as if they're doing this, you know, and but maybe they actually aren't. And it's just a figment of our like way that we have to do science. I think it's important to say that this has to be kind of how things actually are. But that's taking us too far into philosophical debates. So here are some dimensions. And these are, some of them are like disciplines, some of them are more just processes or concepts. But they are, I think it's important when we think about these is that we think that they are all in some way related, right? So that's kind of the main thing here, is maybe to move away from the notion that we have these different processes and they hardly interact except like they feed into each other in one direction, like linearly. And instead, I think there's more like an integrated whole, you know. So I think the most familiar, of course, might be epigenetics. I don't know how much you know about that. You might be familiar with that. I mean, it's just that there are other things outside DNA, the DNA sequence that can affect, turn on and off genes. And this is triggered by environmental factors and behavior, and it can also be passed off to the offspring. So it means that actually there is some inheritance that is extra genetical, you know. So then, and this goes all the way back to Waddington. So here we have another like undercurrent. This is from in 1942, Waddington spoke about this, you know, epigenetic landscape, but his view was completely like suppressed. So you see that within biology, you always had these opposing views, right? So so that complicates the question: what is really going on now? Are we just like picking up these old views? How novel actually is the thing that's going on? Is it just re-emphasizing something? And I think to some degree it is just about re-emphasizing the importance of the organism, because the organism was always there. But maybe that's not enough. I mean, yeah, let's see, not jump ahead too much. Anyway, now it's also development. So it's the notion that organisms produce variation that constrain natural selection, and it's not only conservative, but it also produces novelty in evolution. Basically, it is evolution in a way, because evolution is about change, right? So then it has to be evolutionary. That's the point. And that's why you get like Evo Devo, evolutionary development biology. but also like the other way, development evolutionary biology. So it's like, because you don't want to say that one comes before the other. And so this is about, again, organisms exploiting their reaction norms, producing different phenotypes, and being able to act. So in this view, the genome is less of a program. So we move past the notion, the metaphor of a program, and then we move to more of a notion of repertoire, basically, and that there are different possibilities, and those will be affected by multiple different pathways, developmental, behavioral, whatever. So there are a lot of things going on, basically. So the specific phenotype that an organism will get can only be explained by trying to bring all of these determinants together, basically. So I think here we get a sense of how variation, development, selective retention are not separate but entangled. And so I have a lot of too many slides here. Another you see here's niche construction. Like that's basically again about organism, but in this case is about how they actively change their environment and thereby indirectly uh, affect how they are, how selection works on them. And also you can even say that it would be a kind of ecological inheritance that the next generation would also be subject to, right? And the next generation can respond and then change the environment. So it would not be like the next generation would not be determined by the previous one, right? But it would be affected. So then we have to start thinking in terms of constraints and these kind of things, instead of determinism. And I just mentioned this. This is a classic like counter argument, I guess, against the more like simplistic notions of evolution. Is like, oh, but if evolution is only like random mutations, and they happen discretely, how can you explain something as complex as the eye? And it kind of introduces the notion, oh, there must be some kind of intelligent designer, these kind of things, right? But actually, this is much easier to explain by reference to development and these kind of that you have developmental induction, and also that you have these modules that will constrain the development and these kind of things. And they can explain how we can have these complex structures being so robustly developed in individual after individual, and how mutations also will have hardly any, like, of course, some in rare cases, mutations can have an effect and they will derail these processes, but in most cases, they will happen robustly, right? And that is because there is something more directing this kind of the development of these kind of things over time. So this is then the notion of arrival of the fitness, basically. This is of the fittest. This is how we can explain what develop, like the variation that selection then comes in and stabilizes and blah blah blah, and of course like has an effect on but doesn't create in the sense that we spoke about earlier. There's another thing that's about symbiosis. This is related to Lynn Margulis, which I'm very happy to speak about more at some point. But here we have the notion that we are holobionts. We consist of many different organisms, basically, right? And we have more bacterial cells within our bodies than we have human cells, for instance. And then you have transfer horizontally, not just between generations. And yeah, the notion that organisms are consortia. And I think this article here by Scott Gilbert is very interesting if you want to have a look at this. And one thing worth noting about this is actually that it has been very efficient in treating many diseases, because there's been a problem in many cases where you couldn't find genetic markers for many diseases. And this is because basically we've been to be restricted in our research, right? Because we've only been looking at the genetic markers by human beings, but actually might be that these genetic markers come from other things. And this is where you get a kind of now a lot of research into the relationship between the brain and the gut and these kind of things, right? Which was really ignored in the past. And now we see how important bacteria and these kind of things are, and move away from this kind of negative idea that it's just about getting rid of, that we shouldn't allow any bacteria, and instead saying that actually bacteria is good, but it needs to be kind of the right kind of bacteria. So then I would just show this. This is another kind of just the core assumptions according to then someone from the extended evolutionary synthesis project. So she sets it up like this. I think it's largely correct, but the question is, does it really reflect the current state of evolutionary theory? And I think that is kind of the question, but I think maybe they wouldn't disagree. Like maybe they would say, no, sure, it doesn't quite, but still you have these assumptions. Even if research has moved on, you have these theoretical assumptions still alive. So then I move to the final part, and I think it should take about 2 minutes, hopefully. So basically what I've tried to show is that there are a lot of different dimensions involved here in the move from one theory to another, one theoretical framework, one paradigm, whatever you call it. And I think the main thing is that you have to see that we have to adopt a more complex idea about what evolution is. And I think that's agreed upon. I think nobody would disagree with that. And I think the maybe most important notion here is as well is the kind of dialectical notion that you find in reciprocal causation, and this is something that we will really look more into in the next session. Finally, I want to just offer my analysis of what's going on here, and as I've indicated already, I think this is not really a Kuhnian kind of paradigm. Because, I mean, the modern synthesis is not a Kuhnian paradigm, because it has a much less rigid structure, and it has kind of reorganized without having any revolution, right? So this framework that you have these periods of revolution, and then you have like one grand paradigm that sets the kind of agenda for the whole science. This is not the realistic way of understanding actually how science happens. And instead, you might say that there are like different research traditions operative at the same time, and they can change in a more continuous fashion and allow for amendments and be updated and stuff like that. But I think maybe this is even casting the modern synthesis as a little bit too integrated. And I think when Smokovitis says that it's a moving target, I think she's pointing to this. And this is a conclusion that it's not me that says this. Actually, I take it from others. It's Peter Godfrey Smith first came up with this notion when he was talking about one of the earlier kind of criticisms of the modern synthesis, which was from Susan Oyama. I can find this reference for you. In any case, he says that maybe it's more of a philosophy of nature, but he didn't say it specifically about the modern synthesis. There's a guy called Joseph Roos who made this point in a book a few years ago, where he thinks that this is the direction that Smokovitis is pushing. And I think calling it a philosophy of nature, at least for me, that makes a lot of sense. But I think it's difficult to say what does that mean? Like what kind of philosophy of nature is it? And this is where, I mean, it's not really mechanistic, right? And it's not really organistic, but it has taken up these postures at different moments. So I think basically the fact that it's difficult even to say what kind of philosophy of nature are we dealing with here is not coincidental, right? Because it had a lot of hidden commitments and was more of a narrative that they told them, like that they presented. In any case, what I think is the kind of implications of this is that maybe the problem is aiming for a synthesis, you know? Well, now I see a lot of stuff in the chat. Wait 2 seconds. Okay, I will address this later. I'm almost done now. So what I'm saying is maybe, and this is someone has I can also find the reference for this, but someone has said that maybe the problem is thinking in terms of synthesis itself, and maybe that is kind of reflective of a bit dated notion, like in philosophy of science. And if that means that we have to abandon some views in favor of others, then maybe this is not the right aim. And I think this is maybe the way we are already moving. And I think Kevin Leila has spoke about like how plurality is very important for the extended evolutionary synthesis, and they have kind of downplayed this moniker somewhat in the recent works. But you know, they have been able to establish this idea, and there is a lot of discussion about it, and that's, I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, that's already kind of a success, right? But anyway, I think the point that Roos is saying is that maybe the extended evolutionary synthesis should consider itself as a philosophy of nature, but like unlike the modern synthesis, it should be conscious about this thing. And I think this sets up what I would like to do in the following session, and that is to explore what this kind of philosophy of nature might look like, and argue that I think we can find a more robust one than the one we have. And yeah, this is where I think it's time to stop. I hope, if nothing else, I've been able to show that a lot of these questions are not really scientific, but more historic and philosophical. So thank you for that. I will stop there. And let's see. Please email me if there's any questions. And let's see. I think we should have open for discussion, right? I can have a look at what you've written in the comments first. Yes, so mentioning Simondon, I mean, yeah, Simondon is also a topic that you find within the enactive literature. This notion of individuation is useful, yeah, as a way of thinking in terms of processes. And I think this is really what is encouraged here, that we need a kind of process ontology for sure. So, and then let's see, I wonder if part of the reason this is influence right now is tools and yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. The comment, Peggy or Arnab, if you would like to expand a little bit, I'd be happy to have a discussion about this. Maybe I will understand a little bit better what you're getting at. If I can make just a brief comment about the ATN and the kind of the network metaphor, I would just say that sure, I mean, But like you already mentioned here, like scale effects. And I think if you think in terms of dialectics, the problem with the metaphor of the network is that it levels everything to just one level. And that would be problematic, like in this context, because then how can you justify, then I mean, then you would have the problem, how can you justify the level of the organism as a kind of a level that's irreducible because there's no levels anymore, right? So how would you then like try to model the interaction? Would it just be different nodes like, and would they be autopoietic and not interact? Because then you would have a problem again, because then you would have this kind of like, you see what I mean? Like this is one of the problems that I would take up in the next lecture, because I would criticize the notion of autopoiesis, because autopoiesis is a theory that explains the constitution of different networks as something that's internal, right? In the sense that they are already developed when the interaction with the outside world begins. So the thinking of the whole constitution of the system is actually like internalist, right? In a way. So I think that's a problem that you often find in the kind of network metaphor thinking, is that they think still in terms of autopoiesis, and they take it maybe from, I don't know if they take it from Latour, but they might take it from Luhmann or whatever. And I think that's actually, I think autopoiesis is a very interesting and important idea, but I think it's kind of limited here. And I think if we look at some of the references that I mentioned, like Scott Gilbert in that I mentioned had the view of the holobiont, like that is premised on a different notion than autopoiesis is actually premised on the notion of sympoiesis. And I think might be something that you can look up if you're curious about these things, because sympoiesis then takes it one step further and says, you know, these ecological relationships go all the way down and they are there from the beginning. So it's not like you develop and then you, like afterwards, you create some ecological relationships that affect you. No. From the very beginning, ecology is there, right? And that would be a more dialectical way of thinking, at least in my view, than talking about these things in terms of Latour, for instance. And this, I think, is a limitation of Latour. And I think it's also more like scientifically useful. So I went on for a bit long. Sorry, let me hear from you instead. Please, just go on.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Or
hi, thanks.
whomever. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to something you were saying there, connecting a few things. I was interested in what you were saying about the evolutionary synthesis. Not the modern version, or not the extended version, the modern version, where they were critical of having to expel the notion of sort of vitalism and the sort of life force, where you did speak about that in relation to scale. And I'm just kind of picking up on that comment there, what you were speaking about in terms of scale there as well. And I am wondering if there is, something about the horizontal and the vertical here, in terms of, what I understand by the kind of the network of all being on the one level is very much the horizontal, idea of, how we look at possibility of determination, whereas I guess the vertical does bring us into scale, but then we have a kind of an idea of the kind of transcendental as well, and some kind of circumscription then, in the way that you were speaking about the rhetorical sort of circularity of circumscribing the organism already in a transcendental sense. So I guess actually what I'm getting to there as well, for you, you're queuing up the dialectic here, really. So is there a latent dialectic in what they were sort of dealing with, but they didn't really address it as a dialectic.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's also what Haldane is kind of getting at in the notion of how teleology is like a mistress for the biologist, because it is kind of saying that, you know, they had to assume that there was this kind of level above chemistry and physics. And this is what you get in like the philosophy of like the dialectics of nature by Engels, right? That you have this shift between quantitative from quantitative to qualitative, right? And that's precisely this kind of interaction. And I think it's useful to say, like, we're not just talking about scales, but we are talking about levels. And there's an interaction between scales and levels. And scales would be then like quantitative, and levels would be like qualitative, right? And so this would be like the kind of like you can have within a level, you have different quantitative, different scales, right? And then you can, from this, it can emerge new levels, and then it would have its own principles, right? I write a little bit about this in my thesis in my book, so you could look there, and that there are some references there about this question. As for vitalism, if I can just make one point about vitalism, is that the problem for vitalism, besides the fact that it's a kind of metaphysical idea, of course, there is kind of like, you could say there is some kind of vitalism there, because there is like saying, okay, there is something irreducible about life, you can say. But I think the organizational or organicists, they would say, yeah, there is something irreducible to physics and chemistry, but it doesn't mean that we can't scientifically understand it. You know, we just need some different principles of understanding. So it's not like completely outside of science, you know what I mean? And the problem also for the vitalist theory is that basically it assumed that mechanism was correct, like mechanicism was correct. It just said that we have to add something extra to it, right? But the organicists, they would kind of like cut the Gordian knot and say, no, actually, you know, like we are opposed both to mechanism and vitalism, right? Because we can explain these things in a scientific way without introducing metaphysical concepts like life force and stuff like that, you know. So we can overcome the mechanistic worldview in a different way, basically.
Thank you. Thank you.
So sorry, I think Peggy, please go on.
Well, I think maybe it was unfortunate that I used metaphors, network as a metaphor. I think it's more about the relationship when you're talking about individuation. And I was thinking about with the scale, because he certainly believes in qualities in essence. I was thinking with this scale that sometimes when we're looking at natural things, we don't see the interaction we have in environments, ecology, and biology until there's enough of it going on that you see the change. If it's just a small little quantity, we tend to ignore the relationships. So even if you're collecting data, you don't pay attention to the data until there's enough that you see that there's a clear correlation to things. Does that explain my thinking better? I hope.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think this is also something I will speak about in the next lecture. It touches a little bit upon the notion of criticality. So like critical points, right? That's again like, of course, the most easy thing is just talk about water, and between water, when it boils, it becomes gaseous, or when it freezes, right? And it changes, you know, at these kind of critical intervals, critical points. But a more refined way of thinking about criticality is something you find in the approach I want to discuss next time, and that's the notion of extended criticality. And then it would say that actually, or living systems move within these kind of like intervals of criticality where they change all the time, actually, rapid changes, randomness, but they change within an interval of criticality. So it's not like a set like point. This point changes actually over time. through that, you see, so that you get a much more like dynamic way of thinking about it, that again like will not be something you can explain simply by the principles of physics or chemistry, basically, right? So it's the kind of emphasis on the uniqueness of biological systems, right?
Right. Yes, that makes
Mm.
sense to me. I look forward to next week.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't like, if there are anything that were too like dense or yeah, please just let me know and I can go back and have a look. I know I didn't really like define philosophy of nature. So I have this quotation you can have a look at. That's from Godfrey Smith. This is his kind of notion. I think it's also an open question I want to discuss more with you. How do we think about like what is philosophy of nature? I think that's not given. So, but it's kind of this notion, at least that I think you find all the way back, like in modern philosophy, of course, a lot of work has been done to say, like it's been like two opposing views that also map onto the kind of discussion that we had today about like positivism, right? So at one point you have this kind of positivist view where philosophy, in a sense, could like become redundant in a way, or it has to emulate sciences and be like very atomistic and get rid of all the kind of metaphysical baggage. On the other hand, you have the like more like phenomenological tradition that says, we have to carve out this space for, and also with Kant, right? We have to carve out this space outside of science that is untouchable, and philosophy reigns supreme. There's nothing, that we can't be like touched by science, right? And I think that the more like dialectical view, again, like dialectics, of course, is a word that is thrown around a lot. But I think just to say, like, in simple terms, like someone like Hegel would emphasize in his philosophy of nature that science prepares the kind of the it is already like it prepares the material for philosophy because it already engages in the same kind of theoretization that philosophy does. So a philosophy without science would just be of course, Hegel is known for being someone that seemingly is very, very aloof and abstract. But if you look at what he actually writes about science, and if you look at what he did throughout his lifetime, he worked alongside scientists and he knew a lot about science. So I think this is the kind of thinking that I want to promote here, is that we have to think through very seriously the relationship between science and philosophy and understand that philosophy, in a sense, already is science and science is philosophy. And then we have to think, what kind of science is philosophy? I think philosophy is the science of totality, right? Trying to having like that there's no given kind of subject matter for philosophy, and it can take on any subject matter and try to relate it to the totality. And then totality not in the sense of something given or completed, but something like ongoing. Sorry, I want to hear more questions. If anybody has them, just feel free to intervene whenever. Or if you want to end, we can also end at this point because we have been going on for quite some time. And there are a lot of, okay, Peggy, yeah, if you want to.
So I always worry about this through the whole course. Are we doing a paper? What are you planning on us doing?
This I think is a question better answered by the people that are moderating, because I have heard that there are multiple ways of doing it. You can write a paper, but you can also give a presentation, as far as I know. And also, as far as I know, we will like the next session, we will do more like bit introduction and try to have more of a dialogue. And then I think also there's room for you to present at some point. But I mean, 4 sessions is not much. So, but there will be some kind of like paper or whatever to grade you or like give you a pass on the course. But unfortunately, I'm not completely sure about this at this point. But I can figure it out, of course. And yeah, maybe
Um,
someone knows.
just to give context, Senzo, your hand is up though. Do you want to answer before?
No, I was gonna ask a question on the seminar. You can go ahead first.
Okay, so basically, Rasmus, it's dealer's choice. You're the one who determined which is the best form of response to your 4 sessions. And then also things like presentations are possible. Usually those are set up around readings or themes. And I'd be able to assist you with collecting the data of the people who want to be in various groups. So we could have a chat after this, and then we can just confirm what is the easiest, and from there we will communicate. It
Yeah,
really
I can just say straight away that I will leave it up to the participants then, what they prefer. If they want to do like a presentation, oral presentation, that's fine. And or if they want to write a paper, that's also fine for
okay.
me, or whatever. I mean, they can be also creative and do, different things.
Yeah. We'll just have a chat and then
Yeah,
figure
sure.
figure out what to communicate so people know what they're doing. And I think
Yeah,
it's in relation to Peggy's comment, right? It's just clarity for the way forward.
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay, great. Senza, you still had a question.
I still do. Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Thank you for this first session. I'm gonna try to be pretty lax but on point on what I'm trying to ask, and it's well, we're asking, and I like this position that you are sharing of Gottfried Smith on asking ourselves the question on what do we think about when we think on the philosophy of nature? And from that sense, it is interesting to see that philosophy of nature is always thinking about particular or specific elements within what we think of nature, which sort of makes philosophy of nature like elemental philosophy, philosophy about the elements, right? And in that sense, there is this breakthrough in the history of biology from modern synthesis to the extended evolutionary synthesis on thinking broadly about these elements, like not just, for example, anthropically. And in that sense, I wanted to know if you might have anything to add or pinpoint on the relationship that might be between the extended evolutionary synthesis and this idea of centropism, which it's sort of being developed among other biologically driven practices like syntropic agriculture and other sorts of models which try to go outside of this anthropic window. Because in a sense, I do think that the discussion of extended evolutionary synthesis keeps being framed at times on these barriers of anthropism or anthropocentrism, however the people might want to call them. So I'm not sure if you might see some relation between extended evolutionary synthesis and this idea of centropism instead.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I must say I have not heard about the notion of centropism. How do you spell it?
It's like centropic, the opposite of anthropic, like centropic or architecture, agriculture. I'm gonna type it in the chat.
Okay.
Which these are
Okay.
like models which think synthetically on the role of, on the anthropological role of humans in, for example, the production of agriculture, and instead it posits that our role is rather synthetic. So there's not really like a main role that the anthropic sphere might have, even in the agricultural process, which is an anthropic invention. in that sense, I wanted to know, well, I now know that you're not familiarized with this idea, but well, it's something that maybe we can broaden up in the course.
Yeah, I'm just because there are so many of these tropic different kind of notions flying around. So I was thinking like zootropic was the first I was thinking that you were talking about as the opposite. But I mean, okay, I can try if you can please send me some material on this. I can have a look. But if I may just offer a brief reply based on the stuff that I know is going on, I can say that, for instance, so you have within philosophy of mind, for instance, you have something, of course, you have panpsychism,
Mhm.
right? Which is saying basically everything is have some kind of, it's living in a certain sense, has some kind of sentience, right? And um, what's happening in recent years is that there's a movement towards life and saying that instead of talking about panpsychism, we should have this kind of biopsychism. And I think this is kind of, and you also have within psychology, actually, you have also biogenic psychology. And, but I think the kind of things you are talking about is a bit more like, at least makes me think of like Donna Haraway and her kind of criticism of the notion of the Anthropocene and kind of decentering of the human being, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's think for a second that even if one wants to be the devil's advocate, one could see a lot of falsibility within the argument of anthropocentrism, right? Like it's something that can really be put into test and disproven in a sense. I don't think it's like a really robust idea. If it's something to go against with, one should go against something robust, right? Something that can be criticized. Because if you go against a weak concept, it's easier to sort of like tackle it. And I do
Yeah,
think that anthropocentrism has such, it's sort of a limp idea, to say it in a sense. It's not that
yeah,
concise.
yeah,
So rather synthropic agriculture in particular, it's not an effort against this philosophical notion of current political and environmental issues has been sourced out by human agency. No, it's rather a way of seeing the objective changes within, I'm not sure, for example, biology itself or geological formations or what they now call terraforming, like the actual influence of human agency in seeing how the world develops from certain more specific categories or coordinates like the biological ones. It's rather seeing, trying to be, I guess my interest is seeing how a more realist perspective on evolutionary sciences can develop without the necessity of tackling these sort of weak concepts like anthropocentrism, which don't really define anything, at least from my
mm.
perspective.
No. I think I get the sense of what you're saying, and um, I will look more into it. Uh, if you just, I will search this notion more. And I get your point about anthropocentrism. I think at least in there is a problem in the modern synthesis. That's another part of kind of criticism. Is actually that it focused a lot on animals instead of focusing on plants, for instance. So this then you can say that it's kind of animal centric, right? So that would be like a possible criticism instead of talking about actually saying it was human centric, it was animal centric, right? That would maybe be a possibility here, a way of thinking about it, right?
Which is a fair criticism, actually.
Hmm?
It is a fair criticism to rather seeing it like that,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
it is true.
yeah. So I
It
think
goes
that
back to
that would be kind of a possible criticism you can make that might be more precise in a way.
someone also
So
mentioned that in the comments, like something about abiogenesis and the role this might have on modern synthesis, or if it's even taken into consideration.
yeah, no, I mentioned I mentioned that earlier. That's the basically for the modern synthesis, this is not really something that's taken into account because it's part of what they would describe as molecular biology. So they would just simply dismiss it as something that is outside of their scope in a way, you know. Let's see. Let me try to just sorry, I will just try to address the comments here. So life mind continuity. Yeah, Alina, we will talk about that in activism for sure. This is very important, and Varela, of course, is something we need to discuss. And Evan Thompson is the one that now has this biopsychism idea. But it's already there, of course, in Varela. But I think it's useful because panpsychism might open up kind of the same problems that you have like with vitalism, right? It becomes very speculative. Then you have one about Arnab from Arnab. Let's see. Do you want to make a comment? Like, do you want to expand on your comment or? Let's see.
Oh, sure, Rasmus. Actually, I was thinking of the philosophy of nature and the natural philosophy of Goethe, Schelling, and the German and the English uh, romantics and transcendental idealists on one hand,
Yeah.
and also the Lebens philosophy uh, from German philosophy, which merged with French vitalism and emerged through the, the phenomenological anthropology of Hans Driesch, Jakob Uxwell, and Helmut Plessner in the interwar period, and then contributed to the biopolitics of Negri and Foucault. So I was thinking that whether there was any genealogical studies or comparative intellectual histories on natural philosophy and Leben's philosophy.
Mm. That's a very good question. So, I mean, there is, I think the French and the German tradition have kind of move along different paths here. And so you have, of course, Uexküll, which establishes the notion of Umwelt, and which is important for later thinking, like in ecological psychology and stuff like that. And you have Plessner. I think the guy in Germany that you might be interested in looking at is Hans Jonas, actually. That would be kind of the one that picks up the mantle after Plessner, I think, in Germany. When it comes to Negri and Foucault, I mean, the French tradition, modern French tradition, is very, very opposed to anything to do with Hegel, right? Because they were all influenced by Kojève and his misreading of Hegel.
Right.
And this made them very, very wary of anything to do with dialectics. But still, of course, they adopted some of these notions. It's a very good question. I feel I can't really reply to you that well now. But I would take this, I will remember this comment. I can send you also an article about that compares Plessner and Hans Jonas, which might be useful to you.
Oh, oh, thank you, Rasmus.
But I think they're moving in a much more like vitalist direction, unfortunately, especially Foucault, because he was, of course, a very big fan of Nietzsche.
Right, right.
So I think they're moving a bit away from kind of organicism at least, you know. That would be my yeah.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think it's already implicit in what you say. You almost reply to your own question in the yeah. But I have a colleague. I will write it down. I have a colleague. He wrote a very good book about this kind of intellectual history of biology a few years ago. I can try to remember to share that book. If I forget, just ask me.
Sure, Russell. Sure.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great question, and I will try to remember it for the future. And also, if you want to like expand and discuss this, just write to me and we can have a discussion.
Sure, Russell. I'll do that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've been going on now for 2.5 hours. I think at least I am getting a little bit tired, unless there is some very pressing matter. I suggest we end it now, if that's okay. Please intervene right now if you have anything, if you have anything you need to say. Otherwise, I will end it now. Okay, well, I look forward to getting to know you a bit more and learning more about your interest and stuff like that. And please, like, if there's anything you would like for me to talk about more or whatever, just feel free. Please just write to my email and I will reply to you, or write on WhatsApp or whatever, and I will take it into account for next time. Okay? Hope you have a lovely day and see you in 1 week. And I will send all the material to you. I'll try to do it at least by Sunday. I hope that's okay. I would try not to pile on too much because I think it's no reason to force you to read too much stuff. Okay. Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.
Okay. I don't know if you would you like to ask any question, or because I think we're just gonna have a quick discussion with the moderator.
Yeah. But we can also do it on WhatsApp because we're in a group together. So if you
Yeah,
want,
sure. It's just I prefer to just do it now because it's quite late now, and I don't use my WhatsApp that much.
okay, no worries. So I'm stopping recording.
Yeah.